In an unprecedented moment, President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin engage in a high-stakes dialogue that could alter the course of history. A war that has ravaged Ukraine and sent shockwaves through global economies now teeters on the edge of an uncertain ceasefire. But is peace truly within reach, or is this just another geopolitical chess move? A 30-day ceasefire, but with a catch. The world watched as Ukraine last week agreed to a 30-day ceasefire proposal initiated by the United States. The goal? A temporary halt to bloodshed. But when Trump and Putin spoke, the terms took an unexpected turn.
I think we'll, be talking about land. It's a lot of land. It's a lot different than it was before the wars, And we'll be talking about land. We'll be talking about power plants. That's up, it's a big question. But I think we have a lot of it already discussed very much by both sides.
You'll ask him.
Ukraine and Russia.
Putin flatly rejected the full ceasefire, but agreed to something else. A 30-day ceasefire exclusively targeting energy facilities and infrastructure on both sides of the conflict. A limited truce, yet a potentially pivotal one. Trump took to Truth Social, announcing, I quote, "We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure, with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and, ultimately, an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine." Unquote. But make no mistake, this is far from a definitive peace deal. The Kremlin's response was clear. There are conditions, and they are steep. Putin's non-negotiables: no more US support for Ukraine. The Russian leader's demands were pointed. Moscow's readout of the call underscored what Putin considered a key condition for ending the war: a total cessation of foreign military aid and intelligence support to Kyiv. This proposal is a double-edged sword. Ending military assistance to Ukraine during a ceasefire would leave Russia in a prime position to rearm while effectively freezing Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The US briefly halted military and intelligence support earlier this month, but reinstated it following negotiations in Saudi Arabia. Would Washington now entertain a more permanent freeze? And if so, what would it mean for Ukraine's ability to survive long-term? Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who brokered Ukraine's initial support for the ceasefire, pushed back, saying, I quote, "Now is the time for Putin to show he's serious about peace." Unquote. But does Russia see this as a road to peace or an opportunity to gain the upper hand? The ceasefire's unanswered questions. Even if this limited truce holds, crucial questions remain unanswered. Who enforces the ceasefire? Given the history of failed agreements, skepticism is high. Russia pointed to the serious risks of trusting Kyiv, accusing Ukraine of repeatedly sabotaging past agreements. If Russia violates the truce, would the US retaliate? What about European troops? Peacekeeping enforcement has been discussed, but the prospect of NATO troops in Ukraine is a red line Moscow won't tolerate. How will Ukraine respond? While Kyiv has yet to comment, Ukraine's ability to strike inside Russia has grown exponentially, evidenced by a recent drone attack on a Russian fuel facility in Astrakhan Oblast. Would Ukraine truly halt its counter-offensive in exchange for a 30-day reprieve? Europe's position: skepticism and strategic hesitation. European leaders have largely been cautious about this limited ceasefire, with concerns that it may serve as a strategic pause for Russia rather than a step toward genuine peace. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz expressed skepticism, emphasizing that any ceasefire must include guarantees that prevent Russia from using the truce to reinforce its military. The European Union remains firm in its stance that Ukraine must not be pressured into an unfavorable deal. The EU High Representative Josep Borrell stated, "A ceasefire must not be used as a cover for further aggression. We support diplomatic efforts, but we will not abandon Ukraine in its time of need." NATO allies worry that Trump's engagement with Russia might weaken the Western coalition's unified approach. The prospect of cutting military aid to Ukraine is seen as a dangerous gamble that could tip the war in Moscow's favor. European nations continue to send arms and financial support, with Poland and the Baltic states warning that any US concession to Putin could embolden further aggression. Ukraine's stance: a reluctant participant? Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky remains wary. The Ukrainian government has not officially endorsed the ceasefire on energy infrastructure, and many in Kyiv fear that the deal could be a step toward pressuring Ukraine into territorial concessions, something Zelensky has firmly opposed. Ukraine has been vocal about its need for continued Western support, with Zelensky calling any potential withdrawal of aid a betrayal of democratic values. I quote, "Ukraine does not seek war, but we cannot accept a peace that rewards aggression," unquote, he declared in a recent speech. Kyiv has also raised concerns that a temporary ceasefire will allow Russia to regroup and launch even more aggressive attacks in the future. Ukrainian military officials stress that their goal remains the full liberation of occupied territories, not just a temporary pause in hostilities. Energy, trade, and the future of US-Russia relations. Beyond the battlefield, another topic emerged: economic cooperation. The US readout of the call hinted at a future where Russia and America could rekindle trade and energy partnerships if peace is achieved. The Russian readout echoed this sentiment, stating, I quote, "A number of ideas were discussed that are moving towards the development of mutually beneficial cooperation in the economy and energy sector," unquote. This raises a fascinating possibility. Trump has long wielded economic incentives as leverage, balancing between threats of punishing sanctions and offers of huge economic deals. Could an eventual agreement be built not just on military concessions, but on economic opportunity? However, this also presents a major contradiction. Would the US truly normalize relations with Moscow while Ukraine still suffers under Russian aggression? Would the West accept an uneasy peace if it meant financial gain? The next steps: more talks, more uncertainty. What happens next? Both sides have agreed to further negotiations to be conducted in the Middle East, an ironic setting considering the region's history with drawn-out conflicts. The agenda includes ensuring safe navigation in the Black Sea, a critical issue for global trade, with Ukraine's grain exports and Russian energy shipments both impacted by the war. Maritime ceasefire discussions. Could a truce at sea open the door for broader peace? Expert groups between the US and Russia, a sign that both countries are talking diplomacy seriously, but also a reminder that Ukraine is increasingly sidelined in discussions about its own fate. Conclusion: a fragile truce, a high-stakes gamble. For the first time in months, a step, albeit a small one, towards de-escalation has been taken. But this ceasefire, limited in scope and built on fragile agreements, is more of a temporary pause than a true path to peace. As negotiations continue, the world holds its breath. Will this lead to an end of the war, or simply another cycle of strategic maneuvering? The next moves will determine whether this is a historic breakthrough or just another chapter in a never-ending conflict. Stay tuned as we follow this developing story, and remember, in war, the first casualty is always the truth.